and welcome to the Agora Politics podcast. This is your host, Alex Murshak. With me today is returning guest and friend of the show, Cody Moser. Cody, welcome back.
Hey, great to be here.
It's so good to have you. And, the last time we talked, I believe, was back in August, something like that. And then prior to that, it was right around the beginning of the pandemic. And so we're actually in the process of forming this like weird little thread of interactions right now with regard to the state of the coronavirus. It seems as if we're finally at the point where this nightmare might be actually over for good. I'm here in Michigan. I'm not sure where exactly in the country you are, but it seems like, at least here, despite our governor's best efforts, things are finally starting to open back up, and at least the businesses are getting more comfortable with people coming in, whether you're vaccinated, whether you're not vaccinated. Most of the stores around me are at least requesting that you are fully vaccinated if you come in without a mask. But as far as I know, none of them are like very hardcore about it. They're not asking you to show your papers or anything. How's the state of affairs where you're at?
Well, I'm in Florida, so
So it's
everything's open.
free for all. It's a party down there.
Yeah, if your business is not open at this point, it's probably by choice.
Hmm.
A lot of people are wearing masks by choice. It's a little safer than I think the news is making it out to be. But definitely everything's open right now, including government buildings, every business. Everyone's pretty much good to go, I think.
Yeah, and it's so funny because the states that were very anti-lockdown, like Texas and Florida, turned out not to really be suffering that much, or even that much more, sometimes even less than some of the states that went more hardcore. And I think, the truth will bear out eventually on all of this stuff. So, hopefully the politicians that took irresponsible actions towards their citizens and towards their economies will pay consequences for doing that. Anyway, that is not the topic of our main show today. I just wanted to jump into that briefly because we are in different parts of the country, and I always like to use that as an opportunity to ask about what's going on where other people are located and just sort of compare. Part of the beauty of our federalist system is that we have different states and they're all doing different experiments in governance, and we get to see which ones are working out best. And as long as there's still freedom of movement, which there is to some extent right now still, we can choose to go where we'd like and go to where our policies and preferences are better suited. That being said, today's topic is not related to the coronavirus, so we're going to cut out that chatter for now. I wanted to talk to you today a little bit about science, and in particular, uh, something we call scientism, which is sort of related to many of the, I'd say, claims and different narratives that have popped up, in particular over the last year around coronavirus. But it's not simply limited to the pandemic. Scientism, or really blind faith in certain assumptions in science, or treating science as if it is a set of beliefs that you sort of adapt and then you go through the world following them rather than uh, adhering to the core principles of science, which are, in my opinion, based around more of a process orientation and a sort of consensus building that happens over time and that is always subject to refutation, even by a small minority. Um, Scientism is something that's very, very old, maybe as old as the scientific enterprise itself. And more particularly, we're also going to get into assumptions underlying materialism today. There is a subject who is the core focus of our discussion, which is Rupert Sheldrake. Rupert Sheldrake is a molecular biologist and plant pathologist. Uh, and before we get into Rupert Sheldrake and his sort of criticisms of science and the way in which it's become kind of ideology in our time and even before that a little bit, I wanted to just briefly have, for those of you who maybe haven't met you before, although we've talked a number of times now, uh, a brief introduction to yourself, your credentials, your academic work, and what you've been up to.
Yeah, sure. So as we sort of introduced me earlier, my name's Cody. I'm a PhD student at the University of California, Merced, in their cognitive and information sciences department. Although, I guess in my case, is the information sciences is doing a lot more weight than the cognitive, because I'm very new to the cognitive sciences. My background is largely in anthropology. I used to study primate behavior and a bunch of other things, and then I got into this field of cultural evolution and kind of evolutionary psychology, understanding uh, why it is that we act the way that we are and where some of these traits came from in our evolutionary past.
Mhm.
Um, right now, I'm working on a few different things. I work on things pertaining to like the evolution of music and language. So, for example, like our interactions with animals and how maybe that might have some kind of implication for our language systems. You kind of go around the world. It sounds kind of crackpotish, but you go around the world to like hunter gatherers and traditional tribes and things like that. And while most of the times we're communicating in these Western industrialized societies, we're communicating with other people, but people, out in the real world, I'll call it, communicate with animals all the time, usually to deceive them. So, like prey calls, so, mimicking birds so that other birds come so you can kill them, or, rattling antlers together so that deer think that other deer are fighting to attract them and also kill them. People do that vocally all the time. But aside from that, and in more recent projects, and why I kind of moved to a new academic department for my PhD is I'm working on um, models of cultural evolution, and specifically in terms of innovation and institutions. So, kind of my core question is, how did we get all of this nice stuff that we have? Like, we're talking on a computer right now, um, thousands of miles away from each other. How did we get that, and how do we get more of it? And that's pretty much what I'm interested in now. So,
Yeah, that's a very important question, and I think also this aspect of cultural evolution is going to be very relevant to our talk today because there is always this sort of split between those who think of science as a process and those who think of science as an institution. I saw there was a paper released not too long ago about vaccine skeptics, and there had been sort of an infiltration, supposedly, into the various vaccine skeptic online communities. I think mostly they were on Facebook, but also elsewhere, by a group of scientists. I don't remember where they were from. I think maybe it was MIT. And what they found was that one of the core beliefs of these vaccine skeptic communities was that they thought of science as a more of the process rather than an institution, which is really really funny, coming on down high from these MIT scientists. That would be a surprise to them, and that they would consider that a difference between them. Now, of course, science is both of those things in our colloquial use of the term. How do you think about the history of the development of science and its place as an institution versus a method for, let's say, verifying and propagating truth?
yeah, that's a great question. Um, you know, you and I have spoken a little bit about this topic of knowledge bearing institutions. That if you go back far enough back in time, there were always groups of people, or even one person in a group, who had access to knowledge that other people didn't have. Whether this was because it was things that maybe other people couldn't know. So, like, for example, you think about shamans in some of the earliest hunter gatherer society. The point of the shaman is that he can communicate with a realm that most people really don't have access to. But over time, you do get certain other systems that arise. The big one for me that I often think of is like the monastic system in medieval Europe. For many, many years, you had these institutions that were set aside from the rest of the world, and their only job was to sit there and focus on the knowledge that had been collected in years past. Eventually, all these other systems go away, and something else replaces them. Something that has to be the, I guess, main, vanguard of knowledge in society. And it seems, as of recent years, that would be the university system. It is pretty interesting, though, that the university system didn't necessarily really start with science. It was kind of at the tail end of the monastic system that the university system came to. As monasteries started loaning out their books, and as the printing press started copying the books that the monasteries so coveted, other people had access to them, and more books ended up in more centralized places. You had libraries, Then you had universities, and people just wanted to know what other people thought about the world in years past. Science came much, much later. And what's interesting is that science obviously is a process, but the process itself has become canalized in this like medieval university institution, and we often don't realize that. That really one of the big things about capital S science is that it's able to sit there and gatekeep knowledge and what passes through the entire scientific process without really, you know, what's the word I was going to think of? Any second checks on their system, in a sense, because they do have that institutional pull.
Well, I'll just stop you right there before you go to the next part. Without any second checks, meaning outside verification, verification by those who are not well embedded and sort of verified and authorities, not only inside of the scientific enterprise, but often is the case inside of very particular and narrow disciplines or fields. When we talk about things like the peer review process, those are very insular, often very circular types of knowledge production ecosystems that only involve a very very small number of persons who are given the right or the ability to verify and to choose to accept or reject gatekeeping function, like you said there. Uh, what what gets passed through the system and even has the opportunity to be checked off as science or not science. Uh, I'm sorry, I'll let you continue from there.
Well, yeah, yeah, no, I mean that's kind of the point is that yeah, the in a sense they've gate kept it enough that in order to participate in the activity of science, you also have to participate in the institution. It's not often that you see, well, say back in like the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you saw this a lot. Private industry publishing in journals. You don't see that so much anymore. It's pretty rare. Sometimes you see like nonprofit, almost think tanks publishing things like that. But again, it's mostly university based people who publish scientific papers.
Hmm. And so before we jump right into the man of the hour, now I'm gonna have to preface his introduction with some qualifications, just so that everybody knows that we're not just talking about some random crank. Although I would say that the word crank itself has sort of been weaponized to sort of demonize certain scientific thinkers who dare to kind of question some of the assumptions and dogmas that are attendant to the scientific community. You yourself are not an outsider. You're well within a number of institutions, but you have yourself encountered certain kinds of dogmatism, certain kinds of ideological strains. And here I'm not talking in particular about political ideology, although that is increasingly a problem where it used to not be as well so much. Um, do you want to just talk a little bit about this issue uh, of acceptability within the institutions and sort of the need to conform in order to climb the let's say just the hierarchies within these institutions, as far as you've seen it from your own experience?
Yeah, sure. My background is in anthropology, and if there's a field that kind of forces you to conform, that's the number one field I would say. Um, my I talk about this with a professor of mine all the time, which is that you go to all kinds of fields like say psychology or biology, and if people have disagreements, they stake it out in papers, and that's the end of it. But you go into anthropology, and where disagreements arise, you're either a postmodernist who doesn't think that gravity's real, or you're a fascist who wants to say that everyone basically has a monkey brain. And that's pretty much it. Once that disagreement comes in, it's like, okay, you have to pick a side, and once you're on it, it's done. Anthropology in particular had a bad time with the science wars, which was a period like in the 1990s to early 2000s almost, between the postmodernist perspectives, people who were skeptical of the scientific process and scientific papers that were coming out, and those who said, no, anthropology is a science. We can study people using the scientific method. And that rift really hasn't been healed at all in anthropology. Recently, there was, or not recently, it was maybe 2 years ago, the American Anthropological Association, which is kind of the big organization for cultural anthropology, published a paper saying, hey, biological anthropologists, all you people who study skeletons and genetics, why don't you come back and publish in our journals again? And I published a blog post saying, hey, this might be a good idea, get some consilience back, get everyone to start agreeing after the science wars are done. And I had some colleagues who, lived through the science wars, and they said, no, no, no. I'll never publish in their journal. They don't see me as a scientist, and I don't see them as one either. I don't want to talk to them. So in that case, it's like, yeah, you kind of do have to toe the line there. Um,
Hmm. Well, so there is obviously these factional debates. I think there's sort of a tendency or a bias for everyone to think that their field is the worst field in this regard. And as someone who does not come from a particularly scientific field myself, my field is more closely aligned with political science or philosophy. We don't really pretend to be scientists. And although most philosophers, I think, would argue that you can't really do science without philosophy. And so you actually have to have really good philosophy of science underpinning your methodology if you want to arrive at truth and if you want to be logically consistent and have something that's verifiable and replicable throughout. And in fact, briefly, you mentioned there the split among the postmodernists. I'm noticing in at least the broader discourse, or at least the discourse on Twitter, that there is also the split among sort of those who are sort of staunch. Well, we'll say I won't even say modern. Well, I'll say modernists, right? There are sort of these modernists and a postmodernist split. There are kind of other factions like meta modernists that are popping up, and I've had a number of meta modernists on this show as well, which is I would say sort of an attempt at sort of synthesizing those perspectives a little bit. Um, but one of the things that's interesting to me here, and that's relevant for our conversation today, is that the critiques that postmodernists offer, despite the fact that they maybe don't have as much respect for, let's say, the rigor that might be involved in those who are in opposition to them, is that they actually are quite useful for sort of tearing apart any kind of dogmatic structures that might be there. And so one of the things that I sort of keep returning to is that there are a lot of people, in particular in the political realm, who are saying, look, these postmodernists are trying to apply their theories to our conceptions of politics, to our conceptions of rights and justice, and all these sort of sacred values of political philosophy, and they're complaining that they're ruining the field and that they're creating all kinds of problems, and we need to just sort of, if we could just expel all the postmodern thinking, then we could go back to our perfect state of nature, which apparently existed before the post structuralists. But but my thinking is, look, we can't just pretend that they didn't exist and that they haven't put forward their critiques. We have to actually deal with those critiques as they are. And if it's true that our ideas can't stand up to those critiques, then we ought to find out why. So, as I was saying, uh, it's not that we can just sort of do away with these postmodernists, and they might actually have some interesting critiques that we ought to deal with. Uh, how do you think about the encroachment by sort of postmodern, post structuralist theories that really came out of sort of literary genres or artistic genres of academia, encroaching on, well, not only your field but also natural sciences and other fields as well.
when I was first exposed to this stuff, I thought it was like um, an immediate disaster. I thought it was the worst thing that could have ever happened because I was kind of one of these staunch, Popperite believers that it's like, no, the scientific process is pure, and if we just follow those rules a little bit better, then we will come to arrive at the correct truth. I was always like, this Foucault guy is a fraud. All of them are frauds. They're just saying nice things, and to an extent, I do think a few of them took it a little too far. In anthropology, for example, we had Clifford Geertz, and Geertz did something that really upsets me. I'm kind of fine with this, almost literary perspective for looking at the world or social sciences and things like that. On one condition, which is you can't tell me I can't use science in the meantime. That's my only problem. But, recently I have really come to agree with a good number of their ideas. I read, for example, Paul Feyerabend's book, Against Method, and that kind of flipped my whole worldview upside down from this, rationalist perspective to saying, maybe there's something to what these guys are saying. Feyerabend's idea was, hey, philosophy of science isn't just philosophy of science. We have to understand how it is historically that the best science got through. And he says, really, a lot of times this is pretty absent of the scientific process. So he talks about how Galileo pretty much lied his way through to getting the Copernican revolution started. In many ways, the original view of the planets was more accurate for what tools they had for the time. Galileo was proposing something that at the time really couldn't be measured with what they had. It didn't work out in many ways. He was taking the exact same results of previous experiments and saying, no, look, their results actually confirm what I say, and simply just reinterpreting the end result to say, okay, I'm right. And what's interesting about it is that in that case, science ended up still working out. Things didn't really follow the scientific process in the way that you would have expected it to. But again, it worked out. Foucault is another one who's pretty interesting. Um, I think he gets a bad rep in many places where he shouldn't. Because he didn't say, oh, knowledge is just power and knowledge is only power. He says that in many cases, knowledge formulation comes as a result of wanting more power or using knowledge to get more power. He's not saying, oh, all these facts you know about the world are false. He's just saying, well, think about the ways that they arise. And you see this all the time. I mean, especially like in the last year or so. Let's say, for example, this idea of the lab leak theory. I'm not going to sit here and talk like some kind of expert. I really don't understand that so much. But what I do know is that when that theory first came out, media was saying, this is a conspiracy theory. Fauci was debunking it in front of Congress. Many scientists were saying, massive threads on Twitter saying, I'm going to tell you why Trump's theory is wrong. And now it seems like the tide has turned a little bit on it from saying this is just a completely fraudulent conspiracy theory to saying, maybe there's something to it. And, I'm not going to sit here and say I think it is true or not. I don't know enough. But what's really interesting about that phenomena is the fact that people said it's false in a way to kind of, I would say, detract from the person who was saying it was a thing, who at the time was Trump, to kind of tear him down a little bit. And in the process, tore knowledge down altogether.
Yeah, it's sort of sacrificing their principles and really their credibility. Many of the virologists and epidemiologists there who were staunchly opposed to that theory and demonizing the people who were even entertaining it are really just sacrificing their credibility and the credibility of their field at the altar of political expedience. And so I think that's actually a good example here of why this conversation is so important. People might be wondering, why are we having a conversation about science, scientism, materialism more generally on a podcast that's supposedly about politics? And the reason is that science is a one method that we have of making sense of the world, and it at least for a long time has been the most powerful one we could find. And so it has bearing on our political communities. It has bearing on our epistemological coherence, that we understand science properly, and that those who are entrusted to communicate science to the public are doing so faithfully and are also not being corrupted by different ideological worldviews, whether those are political or otherwise. So, with all of that being said, I think we've set the stage properly then to get into the main topic today, which is this scientist, molecular biologist, and that is Rupert Sheldrake. Rupert Sheldrake is a biochemist with an interest in plant physiology. He holds degrees in natural sciences, a master's in natural science from Clare College, Cambridge. He was also a Frank Knox Fellow in Philosophy and the History of Science at Harvard, as well as a PhD in biochemistry from the University of Cambridge. And that's just a little bit of his credentials there, so that people know that this guy that we're talking about is not some quack who's conducting experiments in his garage. Although I would say that from a pure scientific perspective, we wouldn't necessarily be opposed to that either, as long as it was sound and replicable. Um, but this is a serious scientist who has some serious credentials. And of course, I already mentioned earlier in this conversation that the crank slur always gets thrown around when these elder scientists start throwing their weight around and decide that they finally have enough clout to start speaking freely. He has certainly been demonized himself as a crank. And if you go to his Wikipedia page, they will give you a not so flattering summary from the beginning. They don't even introduce him as a scientist. I think they introduce him as like an author and a conspiracy theorist or something or other like that. But you have known about Rupert Sheldrake a little bit longer than I have. I only recently discovered his work and his ideas several months ago, and I will talk a little bit about that in a moment. But do you want to just give a brief introduction of your view of Rupert Sheldrake and how you came to discover him?
Yeah, sure. To me, Sheldrake's kind of an interesting figure. Um, my interest in Sheldrake comes from kind of this side interest I have in scientific renegades. So, like for example, um, kind of one of my scientific heroes is Freeman Dyson. And one of the reasons I love Freeman Dyson so much is because he was just one of these people who would just be like, say the most outlandish stuff, just so that he could push the envelope a little bit more. And in a sense, I think science needs people like that. Every once in a while, we have to let, and I'll use this term, we have to let the cranks in. We have to let them just say what they say and push it to the limit, so that we can figure out, where they're wrong or where they might be right. I'll give you a great example. B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner was kind of the father, or rather the torchbearer for this idea in psychology called
Mm-hmm.
behaviorism. Behaviorism was this idea that in order to understand psychology, in order to understand the human mind, all you have to understand is behavior as a system of inputs to a system and then outputs. So, why are we influenced by things in our environment and what does it cause? And Skinner at the time was saying, I don't have to understand anything about the mind to understand behavior. What's really interesting is that during a dinner conversation, a philosopher went up to not Rupert Sheldrake, to B.F. Skinner, and he said, "Hey, Skinner, you really think you can explain everything with behaviorism?" And Skinner was like, "Yeah, of course." And the philosopher said, "Okay, explain this to me." And he just said some nonsense sentence to him. He said something like, "There is not a black scorpion falling upon this table." That was the
Hmm.
sentence. And B.F. Skinner, that basically sent him into an existential crisis. And for like the next 20 years, he spent a book trying to answer this guy's one question. And in the book, he basically says, I can define language in terms of the behavioral process. And his answer comes like, towards the end of the book, he says, well, the scorpion represented behaviorism and, you're dropping it on the table. But the whole point is that the book was absurd. B.F. Skinner kind of really pushed the boundaries in terms of how far he could take behaviorism. Um, and one of the people who critiqued it was a fellow named Noam Chomsky. And Noam Chomsky said, hey, no, I'm going to write this book review and say this is why we have to understand some of the inner machinations of the mind. And really, that book review is one of the things that kicked off the cognitive revolution and us understanding cognition. And in a sense, if you were to sit there and look at B.F. Skinner, you would say, this guy needs to shut up. This is nonsense. Stop, stop, stop. His absurd ideas actually led to progress in science. And by shutting him out, we would have just been completely, I guess, stuck on the behaviorist path, I think, in a sense.
Yeah. Well, so behaviorism actually was quite dominant for a period of time and sort of became its own dogmatism itself.
Mm-hmm,
I would agree with you there that there's sort of a digestive process that takes place where you kind of have to move through these ideas as phases to sort of come out the other end, and everybody kind of needs to sort through them themselves, have those debates, have those conversations, and eventually kind of move into the next paradigm, right? The next paradigm of thinking.
mm-hmm.
So I wanted to jump right there from going from B.F. Skinner, who's no, if you guys know Skinner boxes, there's some infamous work he's done there as well. Um, and get right into Rupert Sheldrake and his critiques of materialism. So he says that,
Mm-hmm.
and this is in the book Science Set Free, which I read about a month ago and got through, and actually was very illuminating to me. That book actually is very similar, in my opinion, to something called the Fourth Political Theory, which was proposed by Alexander Dugin. I was watching a lecture or well, actually not a lecture, an interview with Alexander Dugin that was recently posted by my friend Michael Millerman. Michael Millerman translated some of Dugin's work, and though Dugin is very, very controversial in the West, I'm not going to get into his thoughts right now. But one of the things that Millerman says about Dugin, or that Dugin says about himself, that Millerman has repeated, is that when people come to discover Dugin's fourth political theory, there are sort of two general reactions to it. One is that people are totally appalled and disgusted, and they just reject it with as strong of an emphasis as possible. They just want to get rid of it. They want to say that it's that it's fascism, even though it outright claims not to be neither fascist nor communist, but it is anti-liberal. And and the other sort of stereotypical reaction to encountering his idea for the first time is that people want to open a bottle of champagne and they want to celebrate because finally somebody has sort of broken free in their minds the shackles of which they were held to, which at least in the realm of the core tenet or of the core debate, I guess, in late 20th century and early 21st century political theory would be that there's really no choice in terms of regimes on a large scale anymore besides communism, fascism, and liberalism. And so Dugin is sort of trying to stake out this sort of fourth position, not a third positionist, very important not to use that term. And I feel as if when I discovered Rupert Sheldrake's work that I had the same kind of reaction. I wanted to open up a bottle of champagne because it was like, wow, I thought the sciences were dull and boring and weren't making a lot of progress. I think part of the reason why I never even attempted to go into the scientific enterprise myself was because as I grew up, I found that science seemed to be this dull, boring process and they weren't asking really interesting questions. And so I moved more towards philosophy where I felt like I could be more free to ask those important questions. But when I discovered Rupert Sheldrake, I had that very same reaction, which was like, wow, this guy has suddenly opened up a whole new world of inquiry that I thought was sort of closed off eternally to us and that we had sort of
Mm-hmm.
done away with. In particular, he says that there are sort of 10 tenets of the scientific worldview which make up the ideology of materialism. Now, we're not going to probably work through all of these tenets here today because that would take many, many hours of conversation. And by the way, I don't think either of us are qualified to do so, at least with only each other to count on. That being said, I want to just go over the list real quick so that everybody is clear as to what Rupert Sheldrake's criticisms of the ideology of materialism, what he's calling the ideology of materialism, are, and then we can start moving forward from there. So, number one, everything is essentially mechanical. This is the belief that basically everything that we know about the world can be reduced down into very clear mechanistic processes. This goes all the way back to Descartes when we're thinking about the origins of such an idea. Number two, all matter is unconscious. Number three, the total amount of matter and energy is always the same, excepting for the Big Bang. Okay, so this is thermodynamics, and we have the Big Bang here as the sort of exception. You know, if you get the turtles all the way down question going, it always ends back at the Big Bang. Well, what happened before that? Well, there was some big explosion and everything came into being all at once, including all of the matter and energy. It's not really an answer. It's more like a non-answer. Number 4, the laws of nature are fixed. That is, they
Mm.
are stable and they unchanging over all time. Now, again, there's people who are getting up in their seats right now and ready to turn this podcast off. We're not going to be dealing with all of these questions today, but I just wanted to, again, outline his criticisms of what he calls the materialist ideology and give you some food for thought about whether or not these are assumptions that we should just take on their face and whether or not they have, in fact, been proven by science. I know a number of people who call themselves, empirical, scientifically minded materialists, and yet they don't seem to have, in many cases, the thought through many of these questions, or even really, in some cases, have the training to even assess them properly. Number 5, nature is purposeless. That is, evolution has no goal or direction, no telos. We are going to be getting into that one today. Albeit, number 6, all biological inheritance is material. That is, it is carried in the DNA and other material structures. That one we might also be touching on as well. Minds are number 7. Minds are inside heads and nothing but the activities of brains. Okay, so we have the hard problem of consciousness that's been as yet unresolved for centuries now. And one of the things that we know for sure is that we're conscious. We don't know necessarily about a lot of other things, but we know that we have minds. And so one of the assumptions here, one of the core assumptions, according to Rupert Sheldrake and his ideology of materialism, is that minds are inside heads and nothing but the activities of brains. That is, they are reducible again to those physical interactions inside of the brain. Number 8, memories are stored as material traces and in brains and are wiped out at death. Okay, so that's another thing that's been a real big problem, not only in cognitive science, but also in aspects of computer science. We haven't been able to really figure out where are memories stored. Are they sort of made up of the networks between neurons? Is there like are they localized in a certain portion of the brain? Does it happen because certain parts of the brain are communicating with one another? We haven't actually gotten as clear on that as you might think. Number 9, unexplained phenomena, i.e., telepathy, are illusory. This is one that I'm very excited to get into, although I have some reservations about whether or not we should, whether or not it might be prudent to do so. But that's number 9. Number 10, mechanistic medicine is the only kind that really works. Now,
Mm.
this one, I actually don't know why he included this as the 10th assumption, particularly just because it's so specific about medicine here. And this one is very, very dangerous, I would say, if it's taken the wrong way. Of course, right now there has been a rise in popularity in alternative methods of healing, alternative methods of knowing, alternative methods of various kinds of woo-woo type type theories about medicine. And of course, while we're in the middle of this pandemic, that's been a huge question for all of us. Is the soundness of our medicine and issues around quackery in medicine and homeopathy and other things like that. But he's putting that as his number 10 assumption. So, given those 10 assumptions, those are what Rupert Sheldrake uh, posits as the 10 tenets of the scientific worldview that make up the ideology of materialism. I know I just gave you a lot to process there, Cody. I want to just start with that. What do you think of that list?
I mean, it's really interesting. Kind of what you said is that most people don't consider what's on the list, is what's critical there. Um, you know, Probably when he wrote that list, and I have to imagine it was, you can see like parts of his thinking from, he has this idea of morphic resonance,
Yes, we're going to get
that
into that.
okay, yeah, that there's like a physical inheritance that is non-biological, non-environmental. It is physics-based in a sense. You can see a lot of like the attitudes in that. I think the medicine one is really interesting, because while that one might be rather controversial, it's easily his most falsifiable one. It's one that we already know is pretty much patently true. Um, we know, for example, about cultural illnesses that don't exist in other cultures, about how people really can have spells cast on them by other tribes, and they can only be cured by a shaman, something in which you go into these tribes and you try and come up with a mechanistic explanation. You know, you give them malaria pills or you give them some kind of medicine. It doesn't work, and you really do have to appeal to these kind of cultural forms of healing to deal with them. Yeah.
Do you have a specific example of that? And then I have a follow-up question to that as well, just to sketch it out a little bit more clearly.
Yeah, I don't have a specific example. This is something that's documented in medical anthropology quite frequently, about people getting ill because of spells or because they simply believe they have spells. There are all kinds of different factors leading to someone whether or not they're going to get better from an illness or disease. One of which is the idea that they know that there's a cure. That, for instance, is something enough for many scenarios for someone's, immune system bolstered up, to feel better, to do better. And it works in all kinds of cultural cases in which the disease is not apparent. It's a cultural disease. In a sense, it's almost magic. It's not literally magic, but it is in their cultural system magic, and it's working in that way. And it has to have these kind of culture-specific cures. Yeah, I don't have a specific citation for that, but it's quite common.
Well, so I think the most obvious objection here would be that this is some sort of psychosomatism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now, the fact that it could be psychosomatic doesn't actually negate necessarily the claim that these things are, let's say, extra mechanistic. It
Mm-hmm.
just simply means that there's something going on in the brain that's related to their physiological health that we don't quite understand. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, there is also the phenomena of society or cultural wide contagion. That is, certain diseases that pop up that don't have any real physical basis as far as we understand it, but are sort of appear as kind of miasmas as a result of certain cultural conditioning or thinking that's attendant to that age. That as well, I think, would fall under this category of sort of a kind of medicine that is not quite mechanistic, or at least not able to be understood in those terms.
Yeah.
So I wanted to then from I'm not going to get into the laws of nature and whether or not those are fixed, because I don't think either of us are qualified to quite talk on those. But I wanted to specifically zero in on this question of evolution and whether or not it is goal directed and has any kind of telos.
Mm-hmm.
So the claim in tenet number 5 is that nature is purposeless, that evolution has no goal or direction. And if you go back to the early debates around the time when evolutionary theory was being formulated and the ideas of evolution were being introduced, obviously by Darwin as well as others, there is a school of thought that has been sort of relegated to the ruins of history called Lamarckianism, which is very closely related to this idea as well. Do you believe that evolution is without purpose, that it has no telos, or or contrary to that, do you think that there is a reason at least to question that assumption?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me just grab something real quick. Um, it's pretty funny. This is one. So Sheldrake appeared in a documentary series that's like 18 hours long or something ridiculous. And it included Rupert Sheldrake, Oliver Sacks, the neurophysiologist or psychiatrist, Daniel Dennett, Freeman Dyson, Stephen Toulmoon, who's a philosopher, and Stephen Jay Gould, who is very noted for being anti-teleological when it comes to the evolutionary process. And this idea of teleology is that evolution has some kind of goal towards the end. where do I stand on that? I mean, I wouldn't say I'm really a teleologist, but I do know people who do have kind of teleological lines of thought in which they say, well, evolution in a sense is um, trying to preserve against entropy or trying to make more productive use of the energy around it. And in that case, you might assume that um, this process of replication through environments is goal directed. Um, One thing that's interesting, and this is what Stephen Jay Gould, who is a biologist and paleontologist who died in the early 2000s, often brought up, was this idea that if you were to just like go back in time, restart evolution's clock, and play it again, would you get to the same point we are now? Would you get to human beings, effectively apes standing on two legs, talking on podcasts, if you were just to play it all out? It's a pretty interesting question. Um, I don't think we would, but it'd be interesting to see if there was a way. I mean, we do know of places in which organisms have essentially evolved um, certain traits and environments that organisms before them had in those same environments, and that's that kind of feature fit that natural selection provides. That natural selection essentially filters an organism or a population through an environment, fits it so that it maximizes its fitness in those environments. And oftentimes, what you see is that certain traits arise independently um, in different lineages to do the exact same things. And in that sense, you might say, actually, no, evolution is teleological. Um,
Well, uh, so I had Will Buckner on a while back, known as Evolving Moloch on Twitter. He himself is also an anthropologist. And one of the things that I got out of his conversation was that I really understood from talking to him one of the ways of thinking about human beings within anthropology, which is that they're largely shaped by their ecological niches and sort of the incentives and resources and affordances that are available in the environments in which they evolved. Now, this perspective, I would say, based on what you just said there with regard to whether or not evolution has a telos, would say then that no, it doesn't. That sort of how organisms come to be or how they evolve is almost incidental to the niches in which they inhabited and the other organisms that are surrounding them that they're competing with, as well as the various kinds of natural resources and weather conditions, whatever factors you want to include in that. Um, that sort of give rise to the incentives and the various competitive dynamics that they're exposed to. And then those result in various kinds of selection, whether it's through just outright natural selection or more advanced sexual selection, whatever it may be, that's driving it. That perspective is almost reducing the mechanism of evolution down to pure physical processes,
mm-hmm.
something like what Sheldrake here is an opposition to. And with regard to whether or not evolution has a telos, one of the sort of criticisms, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to quite articulate this as well as others may have in the past. One of the criticisms of evolutionary theory is that fitness itself as as a function is not very well defined, and that it can seem as if it's somewhat circular. In that, what do we say organisms are doing? Well, they're trying to survive and reproduce, and that's what makes them fit. It's like, well, what is fitness? Well, fitness is survival and reproduction. So it sort of just goes back on itself.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and what you would get out of that is you would say, well, then all of the evolutionary variation that exists is really just a result of kind of random accidents, right? Random mutations, random decisions, random occurrences that, cut off one evolutionary line and gave preference to another somewhere way, way, way back. And then we're just sort of dealing with the result of these sort of branching off that goes all the way back, infinitely back to the origins of life. Um, and so all this complexity that we see is not necessarily the result of evolution itself moving in a particular direction, but actually is just sort of something that comes out of everything. Now, of course, you also mentioned there that you run into this problem of complexity. Well, how are you getting this what appears to be an increase in complexity of life, when what we know thermodynamically speaking is that the world is moving towards entropy? So how are we getting to use the phrases of Jordan Peterson, how are we getting all this order that's supposedly coming out of a system that is on a macro scale moving into more chaos? Do you find that line of questioning convincing with regard to those who are more biased towards wanting to ascribe perhaps a teleological view of evolution?
Yeah, no, this is a discussion I love. Stephen Jay Gould wrote a book called Full House, where he tried to approach that question similarly, where he said, even if evolution doesn't have a telos, it kind of certainly appears that way, right? Like over evolutionary time, things didn't just stay as single-celled organisms. You and I clearly aren't bacteria, unless there's some superior being looking at us right now saying we're clearly bacteria. Um, but we're not bacteria, clearly. And Gould's answer, which I find almost sufficient, is this idea of the drunkard's walk, which is that a drunk stumbling home from the bar one night, and on his left side he has a wall. Well, as he's stumbling, he's just randomly walking around. He's not necessarily walking in a straight line or towards a specific goal, but every once in a while he bumps into that wall and then he walks right. The important thing to realize is that to the left he has a wall. He can't go down, he can only go up in complexity. And over time, if you just measure his variation as he's walking, he's going to go right a lot further than he goes left, simply because of that wall. Now, what's interesting about that, or not sufficiently answered in that, is why is it that things don't just shrink all the way back down to bacteria periodically? We've had mass extinctions that have been pretty bad in the planet's past. For example, when we had like a huge oxygenation event in Earth's history, and it just like killed off like 98% of life on Earth. Most of it was single-celled, but that did happen. Why is it that we don't continuously get knocked back all the time? Why isn't that humans aren't just continuously returning to monkey? Well, kind of the answer there, I think, is this idea of entrenchment. That if you just think about this idea of the drunkard's walk, I would say, that's only partially right, which is that every once in a while, the drunkard is walking on a path, but then he falls down. And the idea here is that now he's on another tier where he can't go left from that position. So essentially, he's on another drunkard's walk, but this time on another tier, and he can't go back all the way. And I think that's almost a sufficient answer to this question of why things appear teleological. Mm-hmm. That there is a ratcheting effect.
Okay. Well, that's actually very interesting from a computer science perspective, because it's very close to what you would call a random walk in terms of the search space, and you can actually view evolution as as an algorithm that is as a search algorithm, just more plainly. Actually, I had a conversation with Jim Rutt the other day, and he said he gave me a really good nugget of insight, which I kind of already knew, but it was good to be reminded of it, which is that every business is at its core a kind of search algorithm. And the offshoot of that, one offshoot of that, is that there's no way of knowing which search algorithm is optimal.
Yes.
This is called the free lunch theorem. And so if you think of evolution as a search algorithm, I think then it starts to sound a little bit more teleological, because then you have to ask the question, well, what is it searching for? Now, I said at the beginning of this well, actually, I think before we started this conversation off camera, that my friend, not my friend, but our, I would say an email acquaintance, Donald Hoffman, has an interesting theory of perception that involves evolutionary simulations, evolutionary games that are simulated, and the core, I guess, offshoot or thing that he gets out of that is that if you take organisms and you put them into an evolutionary simulation using evolutionary algorithms, what you'll find is that the organisms that tend to succeed, and if you play this iteration over millions and millions of times, so that the probability uh, goes to one. Um, what you find is that the organisms that are most optimized for noticing fitness payoffs will always succeed over the organisms that are looking for truth, that is trying to understand the actual conditions of their
Mm,
environment.
okay.
Now, him and I are going to have a conversation, hopefully at some point soon, that's going to get more clear on his ideas. He sent me a number of his papers, which I have been reviewing. And so I don't have an entirely clear grasp on the full implications of what he's saying quite yet. But it's very interesting because if you think of evolutionary in those terms, then what's happening is that you have all of these search algorithms that are then monitoring the landscape for differing fitness payoffs and optimizing for collecting those payoffs.
Hmm.
That is improving their fitness in whatever way that's defined, um, and that has some various implications. I would say for this question of whether or not evolution is entirely purposeless. One of the things that you might ask then is, well, why would there be this seemingly mathematical a model that is looking for all of these payoffs and is trying to sort of increase its let's say territoriality within space time?
Hmm.
At least that's the dimensions that we know of that we're trapped in. So anyway, that's all a little bit of a side of an aside there, and I don't think we can fully get into all of that today. I want to move on to biological inheritance. This is something that I think you know a bit more about than I do, and ties into this idea of morphic resonance. You mentioned morphic resonance earlier. Morphic resonance, at least from my understanding of Rupert Sheldrake, now I wasn't able to get in direct contact with him. He has whole teams of people that sort of manage him now, so he's a little bit harder to get in touch with these days. But morphic resonance, from as far as I understand it, and this is my layman's understanding, you can correct me or you can explain it yourself a little bit more in depth if you find that my definition is insufficient. Morphic resonance is the idea that organisms which which are structurally similar to other organisms have an effect on them that is time invariant. That is, things that existed in the past that are similar to things that exist in the future. There is a sort of connection uh, outside of linear time, and also not localized by geography, for
Hmm.
example, uh, by by nature, or due to the fact that they are morphologically similar. Uh, and Rupert Sheldrake even goes so far as to claim that something like our twin studies, which are sort of the golden standard for for various kinds of scientific comparisons in trials, are sort of the classic example of identical twins that were separated at birth, right? Are sort of the ideal thing. If you could find those and you can study them on a number of dimensions, then you get a great comparison because they're supposedly, they're genetically as close as you're going to get to identical, and therefore you can work out questions of, let's say, nature versus nurture. I'm very interested in this question myself, just because I happen to be an identical twin, and so I know from observing my own life and that of my identical twin that there are certain uncanny similarities between us, as well as unexplainable differences in how we came to develop. And now, of course, we didn't live the exact same life. We are also influenced by the presence of each other. We were not raised in independent environments. Um, that being said, if Sheldrake's claim of morphic resonance has more to do with morphological similarity than it does necessarily even to let's say genetic encoding, um, then that has all kinds of implications for even this gold standard in science that we have of comparison among twin studies. Uh, what do you think of this idea of morphic resonance? It does not get a lot of, I will say, it does not get a lot of play in the scientific community. It's generally rejected as a theory, and unfortunately, I have not been able to find a lot of solid explanations of morphic resonance besides what's on Rupert's website and many talks that
Mm-hmm.
he's given publicly where he explains it. But I was looking for something a little bit more rigorous, which I have yet to discover. Maybe you know of something. What do you think of morphic resonance?
Yeah, so the book you'll want is called Presence of the Past, and that was kind of his big expose on what morphic resonance is. And it's pretty much as you described it. It's that there is not just biological fit, there's also physical fit in the world. Um, his theory runs into a problem and he probably doesn't see this as a problem in that you don't get the mechanistic explanation of it, and usually what he says is that it's something quantum. But the example that he always gives um, is testing lab rats. And so he says, okay, well, it's interesting that when you take an experiment on lab rats, some kind of behavioral experiment, we were just talking about B.F. Skinner, who famously experimented on rats, says that the first time you try the experiment, the rats are going to be pretty slow. But the second time you try it, they're going to be pretty fast. But he's not talking about rats in the same lab. He's talking about rats in different labs in different countries. His idea
Mm-hmm.
here is that you can do an experiment for the first time in rats in America over and over, and you can train these rats to excel at this, different thing. And then you train rats in Australia, and suddenly you get a result that they do quicker. There's all kinds of reasons that could be. I don't know if this is actually verified. It could just be that people understand the experiments a little bit more. Um, it could be that measurements change. But it is an interesting question. The reason why Sheldrake came up with these things is because he studies plants, and specifically the development of plants. Why do plants get certain shapes? Um, Botany is like, in many senses, going through or has been in this kind of esoteric revolution in which people are now saying, oh, plants have behavior, plants have cognition, plants almost have an understanding. Yeah, cognition. Um, where people have been asking these questions, and um, Sheldrake was really on the forefront of pushing all these ideas about plants. But he later came to say, okay, like let's start talking about why do different organisms have the same structural features over time? Why do we get convergent evolution in biological systems? As we were talking about earlier, natural selection, often brings in this like form fit function, even for different lineages. But Rupert Sheldrake is saying that's not because of biological inheritance or because of the physical environment. That's because of something else, something having to do with just like the mechanics of shape and a almost not when I say physical, I mean physics based inheritance that they have.
Hmm. Well, so in particular, he refers to it as a field
Mm-hmm.
theory. So he's talking about often magnetic fields, which are supposedly what's influencing, in particular, this aspect
Mm-hmm.
of form, right? So, how does a leaf know, for example, based on its DNA inheritance, which is sort of a set of infinite information instructions for coding proteins, what form that leaf will take, right? And of course, even among even within the same plant, all of the leaves that arise on it are going to be slightly different. There's going to be variation among the leaves, um, and so this question of like, I guess one of the core one of the core um, I don't want to say paradoxes. One of the core puzzles that's that Rupert Sheldrake is pointing to when he's talking about this idea of morphic resonance is that we don't understand from what we know about DNA, how exactly organisms come to be formed in the way that they are, simply given the instructions. Now, you can say that there is a sort of a compression function that's happening on the level of DNA, and so what you're actually getting is you're actually getting information that's being compressed down to sort of minimum viable amounts, and then what you have on the physical plane in terms of an organism that grows out of nothing and becomes something, or actually out of a previous organism, but in terms of an organism that comes to be based on the recombination of DNA that gave life to it. In the case of humans, uh, what you have is then a sort of projection happening, right? So you have a projection from one dimension into another, and so you can actually have that's, let's say, a three-dimensional projection that's actually represented with full fidelity in two dimensions. And so that's one idea that sort of explains away this unresolved question. How do you think about that? I mean, is it is that a problem on just a pure informational level that we haven't really dealt with? You know, in this book, I do want to say, at least in the book Science Set Free, all of these tenets that I've listed here that are sort of the basis for us working through this conversation of Rupert Sheldrake, what he does primarily is he takes the core tenets and he rephrases them as
Mm-hmm.
questions. So, is it true that X, or why is it that X? You know, do we know that X? And so, rephrasing them as questions is really more uh, of the attitude, of the orientation that we're having towards these ideas, rather than making outright claims that they are or are not true. Um, so I don't know if I totally erased the question there in that explanation there, but I did want to stay on morphic resonance for a second here, and ask you a little bit about his idea that it's related somehow to
Mm-hmm.
electromagnetic fields.
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. So there was actually um, what Sheldrake is proposing is actually somewhat of an older idea. Um, his part of it is really in proposing this mechanism. If you go back to like the 1910s, there was a biologist, or maybe he's a paleontologist, named Darcy Thompson, and he wrote a book called On Growth and Form. And famously, he
Hmm.
made the argument that all fish are the same shape. An eel is just a fish where you've taken it along this axis and just stretched it out. A sunfish is one where you've just squeezed it. A shark, you just take a few points and raise it up. But essentially, you can get the exact same fish out of every single shape. Unfortunately, Darcy Thompson didn't really understand at the time um, Darwinian inheritance, because this was before the modern synthesis had happened, when genetics and evolution came together. And so Darcy Thompson said that, well, I think it's something physical, that there are mathematical principles leading to why fish are just basically the same shape, and it necessarily doesn't have anything to do with inheritance. Sheldrake's idea about magnetic fields is interesting. He had There's this clip of him where he's talking about how pigeons get home, how passenger pigeons know how to get. You've seen this, where he basically says, during World War II, all these pigeons would be dropped out of bomber planes that were crashing, and sent to go home with a letter saying, "Hey, we crashed around these coordinates. Please save us." And Sheldrake basically goes through all the mechanisms that had been proposed for how it is that these birds were able to get home, back to the British Isles, from the middle of the ocean or from Germany. And he says, okay, what are the reasons? And so he says, maybe was it the magnetic field? Um, Maybe is it, they're using astral navigation or something like that. And he goes through and talks about how all of these ideas had been, discredited. Like he says, okay, people ended up, like blinding these birds and putting them in like spinny cages so that they had no orientation of where they were. If they had some kind of internal gyroscope sending them home, it would be thrown out of whack. He said, we can put basically electrical knobs on their heads so that it screws up the EM field and they can't get back. Um, and the reason I bring this up is because I think one thing about Sheldrake's proposal is that it almost is a little bit more similar to Darcy Thompson in that, yeah, he does talk about maybe it's magnetic or maybe it's electrical. Sometimes he says, oh, maybe it's quantum. Um, I'm not quite sure that he's certain what it is either.
Okay. Well, then we'll leave it at that, I guess. Um, so uh, there there's more than just Rupert Sheldrake's sort of pet theory of morphic resonance. Some of these criticisms that he has of the materialist worldview are um, are a
Mm-hmm.
lot more general, right? A lot more general, and of course, what we really want to talk about is what are the assumptions that are built into our conceptions of science that are sort of getting in the way of the progress of science. He's very careful to note that he's not anti-science in any sense of the word, and in fact, what he wants to do is he
Mm-hmm.
wants to improve science by forcing it to address these criticisms. Um, One of them is, of course, this idea that unexplained phenomena, that is anything that we don't have a testable way of verifying or negating, uh, is something that we should just throw away and preclude to the realm of hokiness or mysticism or something that's outside
Mm-hmm.
of the purview of science altogether, and therefore also under our sort of materialist paradigm that we're in right now, therefore also garbage more or less, by as far as many people would consider it. And the one thing that he brings up that sort of gets everybody, in a rut is this idea of telepathy. Now, there are other things that he talks about as well, like remote viewing, or even the phenomenon of people sensing that other people are looking at them when their back is turned. This is a very common experience that almost everybody has reported feeling, at least subjectively. Now he claims that there are experiments that he has carried out and that others have carried out that show that in fact there is something to it, and these aren't just intuitions that we have. Or that we know about from watching too many sci-fi movies or something like that. What do you think about his claims of not treating unexplained or unexplainable phenomena as illusory? I think that's an interesting way that he phrases it there because, contrary to that, he has actually gone through and tried to conduct small scale experiments to show that they're not illusory. So how do you think about, these sort of these claims around various kinds of, I guess, subjective experiences that many people have, or that most people have in some cases, that the scientific
Mm-hmm.
establishment, let's say, tends to just reject outright as sort of paranormal thinking or parapsychology, things along
Yeah,
those
it's a great
lines.
question. It's pretty funny the telepathy thing. I don't really believe in it, but a lot of people have. You look at, like, for example, Alan Turing, and when he was coming up with the Turing test,
Hmm.
he said, this is the reason why we can say computers are eventually going to be conscious. He had about like 9 or 10 critiques that he had to address from all these people who said, no, this is why computers will never be conscious. The only one he actually took seriously was this idea of telepathy. Like, someone said to him, yeah, but like, what about like people can mind read and computers can't? And he was like, ah, damn, you got me there. I don't know how we're going to get computers to get there.
That's great. That's a great little
Yeah,
bit of
yeah.
trivia.
My thought towards these things personally, on a personal level, is put a pin in it. If you think something's weird, to me, that's reason enough to start asking questions about it. Say, okay, why do we have this thing? Um, why do humans tend to feel that way? Uh, you know, when proposing a mechanism, obviously you have to be able to tack it down to something. This goes back to this issue of the mechanistic process that we talked about Sheldrake, and this is something I kind of disagree with him on. It isn't necessarily that there are things that don't have a mechanism. Um, the problem is that if you don't have a mechanism, you can't really describe what it is that you're even talking about. In many cases, you have this kind of vague view of, well, we know someone's looking at us, and that's like a thing. And it's like, okay, but like, what is that? Like, when you get down to it, what is it, other than an intuition? And if you're going to be able to describe what something even is, you have to be able to break it down into its parts. But the point is, isn't that necessarily that these ideas about telepathy or farsight or anything like that are true? It's that the question needs to remain open. It's that we have had many questions about the world in the past that maybe we weren't able to address before. And it was a very unfortunate thing because we didn't have the necessary tools. We didn't take things seriously on like a cultural standpoint. The idea is to kind of let any question in, but when it comes to explanations, put a pin in it. And unfortunately, oftentimes that's not how science works. And one thing is that there really isn't that much support for looking for things that don't already have an established mechanism of sorts. Um, I can't imagine without Darwin, tacking it down in this like massive, thick volume where he just like broke down every single farm animal and said, we know why they got like long hooves or long udders or whatever. That's the same thing that happens in biological systems. I can't imagine that, a scientific institution would just start spending money on something like that without the mechanism already being there. But it was something that was true. There is support, of course, from private institutions. Things like the Templeton Foundation gives money to very serious scientists studying like human evolution, studying things like physics. Obviously, that's a big Templeton